Rain hammered against the tinted glass of the SUV, washing away the city's grime, but never the exhaustion. Declan rubbed his temples, phone pressed to his ear, listening to numbers that didn't matter. Then came Garrett's voice, rough and hesitant over the intercom. "Sir, she's been sleeping here." Declan lowered the phone. Concrete, damp wool, a curled figure shivering by the service elevator. It wasn't a threat. It was a complication. And complications usually required a bullet, not a blanket. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a persistent, mechanical hum that vibrated in the roots of Declan's teeth. The subterranean garage of the estate always smelled the same: motor oil, damp earth, and the metallic tang of exhaust. He stepped out of the SUV, the heavy armor-plated door shutting behind him, with a dense, final thud that echoed off the concrete pillars. His phone was still in his hand. On the screen, a suspended call with a man in Chicago who owed him $300,000. Declan's thumb hovered over the red icon. He was 38 years old. His back ached from sitting in imported leather seats for 6 hours, and he had a mild, nagging headache pressing behind his right eye. He just wanted a glass of scotch and 4 hours of uninterrupted silence. Then he saw Garrett. The guard was standing near the reinforced steel doors of the private service elevator. Garrett was a big man, built like a brick wall, usually possessing the emotional range of 1, 2. But right now, his posture was wrong. His shoulders were slumped, his heavy tactical boots shifting uneasily on the epoxy-coated floor. He had one hand resting near the holster at his hip, a habit, not an intent, and he was staring downward. Declan walked over, the sharp clack of his dress shoes slicing through the quiet. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The air in the garage shifted as he approached, pulling taut. "Sir," Garrett murmured. He didn't look up. He pointed a thick, calloused finger. "She's been sleeping here." Declan stopped. He let the phone drop to his side, the screen finally going black. She was tucked into the alcove between the concrete pillar and the elevator shaft. A pile of discarded cardboard, likely left behind by the morning's delivery crew, served as a barrier against the freezing floor. On top of it lay a woman. She wasn't beautiful in the tragic, romantic sense. She was a mess. Her coat was a dark, shapeless mass of wet wool that smelled faintly of mildew and wet dog. It was 2 sizes too big, the sleeves hanging over her hands, which were tucked tightly between her knees for warmth. Her face was half buried in the collar, but Declan could see the harsh, sharp lines of her cheekbones, hollowed out by missing meals. Her hair, a dirty, matted blonde, clung to her forehead in greasy strands. She was shivering. It wasn't a delicate tremor. It was a violent, whole-body shaking that rattled her teeth. The sound was audible, a faint, rhythmic clicking of bone in the quiet garage. "How long?" Declan asked. His voice was flat. No anger, no surprise. Just the dry friction of a man assessing a logistics problem. "Cameras show her slipping through the delivery gate at 14, all cow," Garrett said, his voice dropping another octave, as if afraid to wake her. She found the blind spot, tucked herself in. Hasn't moved since. Declan stared down at her. He felt nothing resembling pity. Pity was a useless emotion, a vulnerability that got men in his line of work gutted. What he felt was a profound, irritating exhaustion. This was his secure building, his fortress, and a stray had simply wandered in and used it as a motel. "Why didn't you clear her out?" Declan asked, his eyes tracing the line of a nasty, purpling bruise along her exposed jawline. Garrett hesitated. "I was going to, boss. But look at her." I walked up, kicked her shoe. She didn't even stir, just groaned and curled tighter. Figured she might be sick or dying. Didn't want to drag a corpse onto the street without asking you first. Declan sighed, a long, slow exhale through his nose. He crouched down, his tailored wool trousers strained at the knees. The closer he got, the worse she smelled. It was the scent of the city's underbelly, stale sweat, exhaust fumes, cheap soap, and something sour, like fear. He didn't gently brush the hair from her face. He reached out with 2 fingers, his leather glove creaking, and grabbed her by the lapel of the oversized coat. He pulled, just hard enough to shift her weight. She didn't wake gracefully. A sharp, wet gasp ripped from her throat. Her eyes snapped open, wide and bloodshot, the white stark against the grime on her face. For a fraction of a second, she was utterly blank. Then, the terror hit. She scrambled backward, the friction of her denim jeans tearing against the cardboard. Her back slammed into the cold steel of the elevator door with a hollow thump. She didn't scream. That was the first thing Declan noted. People who screamed expected to be saved. People who stayed silent knew nobody was coming. She brought her hands up, instinctively shielding her face, her chest heaving. A rough, rattling cough tore out of her, forcing her to bend forward. She gagged, clutching her ribs, fighting for air in the damp garage. Declan didn't move. He stayed in his crouch, watching her with the detached precision of a man who dealt in violence daily. He noted the way she favored her left side. Broken rib, maybe just bruised. He noted her eyes, hazel, dilated, darting wildly between him and Garrett. "Get up," Declan said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that left no room for negotiation. It was a voice accustomed to ending lives, not saving them. The woman swallowed hard, pressing herself flat against the door. "I'm sorry," she rasped. Her voice sounded like crushed glass. "I'm leaving. I didn't take anything. Just let me go." She tried to push herself up using the concrete wall, but her legs were numb from the cold. Her knee buckled, and she collapsed back onto the cardboard, her hand scraping against the floor. A sharp hiss escaped her lips as the skin peeled back from her palm. Declan rubbed the bridge of his nose. He was too tired for this. He should nod to Garrett. Garrett would haul her up by her armpits, drag her to the street, and dump her on the curb. She would freeze tonight, or she would crawl into a different hole. Either way, the estate would be clean. He looked at her hands. They were trembling violently, smeared with grease and a fresh bead of dark blood from the scrape. She was trying to wipe the blood off on her coat, hiding the injury, trying to make herself smaller. A strange, contradictory impulse flared in Declan's chest. It wasn't compassion. It was a sick, twisted sense of control. He despised disorder, and right now she was a chaotic, broken thing bleeding on his property. "Empty your pockets," Declan ordered. She froze. "What?" "You heard him," Garrett rumbled, taking a half step forward. "No, wait, please," she stammered, her fingers fumbling with the oversized pockets of her coat. She pulled out her belongings with shaking hands, dropping them onto the concrete between them. A chapstick, a crushed granola bar wrapper, 3 crumpled dollar bills, and a small, dull pocket knife. Declan looked at the pathetic pile. He looked at the knife, then up at her face. She looked terrified he would punish her for having a weapon, but the blade was so rusted he doubted it could cut butter. "Is that it?" he asked. She nodded rapidly, hugging herself. "Please, I'll go. I didn't know whose building this was. I just saw the gate open." Declan stood up slowly. His joints popped. He looked down at her from his full height. She shrank back, bracing for a blow. He recognized that flinch. It was the flinch of someone who had been hit enough times to know exactly how it felt before the fist even landed. "Garrett," Declan said, not taking his eyes off the woman. "Yeah, boss. Take her bag. If she has one, toss it." "I don't have a bag," she whispered, her voice cracking. Declan stared at her. "What's your name?" "Maeve," she lied. He could tell it was a lie by the slight hesitation, the way her eyes flicked to the left. He didn't care. Maeve was as good a name as any. "Listen to me, Maeve," Declan said, his tone devoid of warmth. "If you stand up and walk out that gate, you will freeze to death by 3 a.m. The temperature is dropping to 12 degrees. She swallowed, wrapping the coat tighter around her thin frame. "I'll keep walking." "No, you won't. You can't even stand." Declan ran a hand through his hair, cursing himself internally. He was breaking his own rules. It was a sloppy, sentimental mistake, born of exhaustion and the strange silence of the night. "Garrett, call the elevator." Garrett blinked, his heavy brow furrowing. "Boss? You want me to bring her up?" Did I stutter? Garrett quickly turned and slammed his hand against the call button. The gears behind the steel doors groaned to life. Maeve looked between them, her panic spiking. She pushed herself up against the wall, sliding sideways. No, I'm not going anywhere with you. I'm leaving." She tried to bolt. It was a pathetic attempt. She took 2 staggering steps before her legs gave out entirely. She pitched forward, bracing for the hard impact of the concrete. It didn't come. Declan caught her. He didn't catch her in a smooth, sweeping embrace. He grabbed her roughly by the scruff of her heavy coat, yanking her upright. The momentum jerked her backward, and she slammed into his chest. He grunted, smelling the damp wool and unwashed skin up close. She felt like a bag of bones hidden beneath heavy fabric. She struggled, kicking out wildly, her heel connecting with his shin. "Stop fighting, you idiot!" Declan snarled, tightening his grip on her collar. "I'm not going to kill you. If I wanted you dead, you'd be bleeding on the floor right now." The raw, brutal honesty of his words shocked her into stillness. She hung suspended in his grip, breathing heavily, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked up at him over her shoulder. His face was a mask of cold annoyance, his jaw set, his dark eyes empty of anything remotely human. The elevator doors slid open with a soft ping. "Get in," Declan commanded, shoving her lightly toward the open cabin. The interior of the private elevator was lined with mirrored panels and polished brass. The light was bright, unforgiving, and sterile. When the doors closed, sealing them inside, the silence was absolute, save for the faint hum of the cables pulling them upward. Maeve stood as far away from Declan as the small space allowed, pressing her spine into the corner. Under the harsh halogen lights, she looked even worse. The bruise on her jaw was a mottled canvas of black and purple, spreading down her neck. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and the dark circles under her eyes made her look skeletal. Declan stood in the center, perfectly still, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. He didn't look at her. He watched the digital numbers above the door tick upward. 10, 20, 30. He could feel her staring at him. He knew what she saw. A man in a $3,000 suit, smelling of expensive cologne and old violence. She was trying to calculate her odds of survival. He let her. It was better she remained afraid. Fear was predictable. "You're making a mess of my elevator," he said quietly. Maeve flinched, looking down. The snow and dirty water from her coat and boots were dripping onto the immaculate cream-colored carpet, leaving dark, muddy stains. I'm sorry," she whispered, trying to gather the dripping edges of her coat into her hands. "Leave it," he said, irritated. The elevator slowed, coming to a smooth halt at the penthouse floor. The door slid open, revealing a massive, open-concept space bathed in shadow. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glittering skyline of the city. City lights reflecting off polished hardwood floors and black marble countertops. It was a beautiful, lifeless tomb. Declan stepped out, unbuttoning his suit jacket. "Come." Maeve hesitated, hovering on the threshold. The apartment looked like an art gallery. She looked down at her muddy, ruined boots. "Now!" Declan snapped. She jumped, stepping awkwardly out of the elevator. Her wet boots squeaked against the polished wood. Every step left a smudge. She stood frozen in the foyer, afraid to move, afraid to touch anything. Declan walked into the sprawling kitchen. He tossed his keys onto the counter with a sharp clatter and shrugged off his jacket, draping it over a stool. He loosened his silk tie and undid the top 2 buttons of his shirt. He wasn't doing this to make her comfortable. He was simply ending his day. He walked to the large industrial refrigerator, opening it. The cold light spilled over him. "Take the boots off," he called out without looking back. "Leave them by the door." Maeve scrambled to obey. She leaned against the wall, struggling with the wet, knotted laces with numb fingers. When she finally pried the boots off, she stood in socks that were damp and riddled with holes. Declan emerged from the kitchen carrying a bottle of amber liquid and a heavy crystal glass. In his other hand, he held a dark grey towel. He walked back into the living area and stopped in front of her. He tossed the towel at her. It hit her in the chest, and she scrambled to catch it. "Dry your hair. You're dripping on the wood." He gestured toward the kitchen area with the hand holding the glass. "Go sit on the tile floor in the kitchen. Don't sit on the furniture." It wasn't a kind request. It was a practical, demeaning command. Yet it was exactly what she needed. The clear boundary, the lack of feigned warmth. It made sense to her. She nodded, clutching the soft, heavy towel, and padded in her wet socks toward the kitchen. She found a spot near the edge of the large kitchen island, sitting awkwardly on the cold, grey slate tiles. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping the towel over her wet hair, shivering as the damp cold of her clothes pressed against her skin. Declan walked into the kitchen, his leather shoes clicking rhythmically. He set the bottle and glass on the counter, directly above where she was sitting on the floor. He poured a generous measure of scotch. The amber liquid hit the crystal with a soft, expensive sound. He didn't offer her a drink. He didn't ask if she was hungry. He took a slow sip of his scotch, his eyes closing briefly as the alcohol burned its way down his throat, cutting through the fatigue. He leaned against the counter, looking down at her. She was furiously rubbing the towel over her head, her face hidden. "Who did you piss off?" he asked, his voice low in the quiet apartment. Maeve stopped rubbing. She didn't look up immediately. She lowered the towel, revealing damp, tangled hair, framing her bruised face. She looked at his polished shoes, then slowly up his legs, to his face. "Nobody," she said, her voice hoarse. "I just fell." Declan let out a short, humorless breath that sounded like a laugh, but wasn't. "You fell repeatedly onto someone's knuckles." "Right. I don't care about your drama, Maeve, but I need to know if someone is going to come looking for you and shoot up my lobby." "No," she said quickly, desperately. "No one is looking for me, I swear." Declan took another sip of his drink. He studied her. She was a liar, but she was telling the truth about that. Nobody was looking for her. She was invisible. "Good," he said flatly. He set his glass down. The ice clinked. He turned his back on her and walked toward the hallway leading to his master suite. "Stay on the tiles," he called out over his shoulder. "If you try to steal anything, the alarms will trigger. If you try to leave, The guard downstairs will shoot you." He didn't wait for a response. He walked down the hall, the darkness swallowing him, leaving Maeve alone on the cold floor of a monster's castle. She sat there in the heavy silence, listening to the hum of the high-end refrigerator. She was shivering, starving, and bruised, sitting on a hard stone floor. But for the first time in weeks, she felt the agonizing, terrifying relief of knowing she wasn't going to die tonight. She buried her face in the thick, dry fabric of the towel and wept silently, letting the tears mix with the dirt on her face. Sunlight was a luxury Declan rarely enjoyed. It sliced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse like a scalpel, sharp and blinding, exposing the dust motes dancing over the black marble. He stood at the edge of the kitchen, tightening the belt of his dark silk robe, a fresh cigarette clamped unlit between his teeth. He had slept for exactly 3 hours and 42 minutes. His head throbbed in time with his pulse. His eyes drifted downward. She was exactly where he had left her. Maeve hadn't moved to the rug. She hadn't tried to crawl onto the velvet sofa. She was a tight, miserable knot on the grey slate tiles, her knees tucked beneath her chin, still wearing the oversized, foul-smelling coat. The grey towel he had thrown at her last night was pulled over her head like a shroud. Declan walked past her. He didn't step lightly to avoid waking her. His bare heels struck the hardwood, then the tile, authoritative and heavy. He reached the espresso machine, a hulking mass of chrome and copper, and flipped the power switch. The machine hissed, releasing a sharp puff of steam. On the floor, the pile of wool twitched. Declan ignored it. He ground the beans, dark roast, oily and bitter, the mechanical whir of the grinder shattering the morning quiet. He tamped the grounds, locked the portafilter into place, and pulled a double shot. The rich, acidic scent of coffee filled the space, overpowering the lingering smell of stale dampness Maeve had dragged in. He took his first sip. It was scalding, burning the roof of his mouth. It grounded him. Only then did he turn his attention back to the woman on his floor. "Get up," he said. The cigarette bobbed in his mouth. She didn't move. Declan frowned. He set the espresso cup down on the counter with a definitive clink. He walked over and stood directly above her. He could hear her breathing now. It wasn't the slow, even rhythm of sleep. It was a shallow, rapid wheeze. With every inhale, a wet, rattling sound echoed deep in her chest. Maeve. He nudged her shoulder with the side of his foot. Not a kick, but not a gentle tap either. She rolled onto her back, and the towel slipped away from her face. Declan went perfectly still. Her skin was a translucent, ghastly white, slick with a layer of greasy sweat. The bruise on her jaw had darkened to a violent plum color, but it was the flush high on her cheekbones that caught his attention. It was the unnatural, burning red of a severe fever. Her lips were parted, cracking at the corners, pulling in quick, desperate gasps of air. Declan swore softly. He crouched, the silk of his robe pooling on the cold tile. He pressed the back of his hand against her forehead. She was burning alive. The heat radiating from her skin was alarming. As soon as his cold hand touched her, Maeve's eyes fluttered open. They were glassy, unfocused, darting around without seeing him. She let out a whimpering, fractured sound and weakly batted his hand away. "No," she mumbled, her voice entirely stripped of resonance. Cold. Just cold. She tried to curl back onto her side, seeking the freezing comfort of the slate tile against her burning skin. Declan stood up, wiping his hand on his robe. He felt a sharp spike of irritation. This was precisely why he didn't pick up strays. They brought complications. If she died on his kitchen floor, He would have to have Garrett roll her up in a drop cloth and dispose of her. It would ruin his morning. It would require bleach. He pulled his phone from the pocket of his robe and dialed a number. It rang twice. "Yeah," a gravelly voice answered. "Weaver, get your bag and come up to the penthouse. Bring broad-spectrum antibiotics and an IV kit." There was a pause on the line. "Boss, you catch a stray bullet." "Just get up here," Declan snapped, and hung up. He looked down at Maeve. She had started to shake again, a violent, rattling tremor that caused her teeth to click together. Her filthy hands gripped the lapels of her coat, trying to pull it tighter. Declan sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He walked into the living room, grabbed a heavy cashmere throw blanket off the back of the sofa, and returned to the kitchen. He dropped it over her. It was a careless gesture. He didn't tuck it in. He took his espresso and went to stand by the window, watching the city below wake up, waiting for the doctor to arrive and take this problem off his hands. Dr. Thomas Weaver did not look like a man of medicine. He was short, entirely bald, and wore a rumpled corduroy jacket that smelled permanently of stale smoke and peppermint breath mints. He carried a battered leather medical bag that had seen more gunshot wounds in poorly lit warehouses than most trauma surgeons saw in a lifetime. Weaver stepped out of the private elevator, chewing aggressively on a mint. He took one look at the pristine penthouse, then his eyes landed on the bundle of cashmere and dirty wool on the kitchen floor. "Christ, Declan," Weaver muttered, dropping his bag on the marble island. "You couldn't put her on a couch?" "She was dripping," Declan replied. He was sitting on a bar stool, nursing his second espresso, scrolling through an encrypted tablet. "Fix her," Weaver grunted, snapping a pair of blue nitrile gloves onto his hands. He knelt beside Maeve and pulled the cashmere blanket back. The smell hit him, and his nose crinkled. He didn't say a word. He was a professional in a very ugly world. He unbuttoned the top of Maeve's coat to get his stethoscope against her chest. As the cold metal touched her skin, Maeve arched off the floor with a sudden, violent gasp. "Hold her down," Weaver barked. Declan dropped his tablet. He slid off the stool, moving with terrifying speed for a man his size. He dropped to his knees on the opposite side of Maeve and clamped his hands down on her shoulders, pinning her flat against the tile. Her eyes snapped open. The fever had stripped away whatever rational thought she had left. She didn't see Declan, the man who had let her stay. She saw a threat. She screamed, a raw, tearing sound that scraped her throat raw. She thrashed wildly, her nails clawing at Declan's wrists. She managed to rip a deep scratch down his forearm, drawing a bright bead of blood. Declan didn't flinch. He didn't try to soothe her. He just leaned his weight forward, his grip tightening like a vice until she couldn't move her upper body. "Stop fighting," Declan ordered, his voice an authoritative, flat rumble right next to her ear. "You are wasting energy you don't have." "Get off," she sobbed, her head whipping back and forth. "Please, I didn't see anything." Declan's jaw clenched. "I didn't see anything," a phrase exclusively spoken by people accustomed to being beaten for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Weaver, hurry it up!" Declan growled, his muscles bunching as Maeve managed to buck her hips, trying to dislodge him. "I'm going as fast as I can, boss," Weaver said calmly. He listened to her chest for another 10 seconds, then pulled the stethoscope from his ears. He began pressing his fingers expertly along her ribcage. Maeve shrieked as he hit her left side, her body going rigidly taut under Declan's hands. "2 cracked ribs," Weaver muttered, opening his bag. "Maybe 3. Left side. But that's not what's killing her. Listen to her breathing. Fluid in the lungs. Advanced pneumonia. And she's severely malnourished. Her resting heart rate is a disaster. She's dehydrated to the point of organ strain. Weaver pulled out a saline bag, tubing, and a thick needle. I need an arm. Declan shifted his weight, using his right forearm to pin both of Maeve's shoulders while using his left hand to grab her thrashing right arm. He pinned her wrist to the floor, holding her arm straight. Maeve's frantic eyes locked onto the needle. No. No needles, please, please. Look at me, Declan snapped. She didn't. She stared at the needle, hyperventilating. Declan roughly grabbed her jaw with his free hand, forcing her face toward his. I said, look at me. Her wild, fever-bright eyes finally met his cold, dark ones. This man is going to put a needle in your arm. It will hurt. Then you're going to go to sleep. If you keep fighting, I will have him sedate you with something that will make you feel like you're drowning. Choose. It was a cruel thing to say. It was a necessary thing to say. The blunt threat sliced through her panic. She stared at him, her chest heaving, tears spilling over the bridge of her nose and mixing with the grime on her cheeks. Slowly, the fight drained out of her. She went limp against the tiles, closing her eyes tight. Good, Declan said softly. He didn't let go of her jaw until Weaver had pierced the vein and taped the catheter down. Weaver hooked the saline bag to the handle of a lower kitchen cabinet. He injected 2 vials of liquid directly into the IV line. Broad-spectrum antibiotics and a mild sedative, Weaver explained, standing up and peeling off his gloves. She needs sleep. She needs a warm environment. And when she wakes up, she needs clear liquids. Broth. No solid food yet. Her stomach will reject it. Weaver looked down at Maeve, whose breathing was already beginning to slow as the sedative hit her bloodstream. He looked back at Declan, who was still kneeling on the floor, staring at the scratch on his wrist. I'm not running a hospice, Tom, Declan said, his voice quiet and dangerous. I know, boss, Weaver said, packing his bag. But if you put her back on the street today, she'll be a corpse by sundown. The pneumonia is aggressive. Keep her inside for 3 days. Let the antibiotics do the heavy lifting, then toss her out. Weaver picked up his bag. He paused by the elevator. And Declan? Put her in a bed. The floor is leaching whatever body heat she has left. The elevator doors closed. Declan remained on the floor for a long time, listening to the drip of the IV fluid and the wet, rattling breaths of the woman who had ruined his morning. The guest bedroom was located at the far end of the penthouse corridor. It was a sprawling, immaculate space, decorated in muted charcoals and stark whites. The bed was a massive king-size frame, draped in high thread-count Egyptian cotton and heavy duvet covers. It looked like a page out of an architectural digest. It looked utterly untouched. Declan carried her. He hadn't wanted to. He had stared at her unconscious form on the kitchen floor, debating whether to drag her by her coat or have Garrett do it. In the end, he did it himself, purely because he didn't want Garrett's muddy boots on the bedroom carpets. She weighed nothing. As he lifted her, her head lolled back against his shoulder, exposing the long, bruised column of her neck. She felt fragile, like a bundle of hollow reeds. He laid her down on top of the immaculate white duvet. The contrast was offensive. Her filthy coat, the grease on her skin, the damp, smelly socks. She was a stain on the perfection of the room. Declan stood by the bed, his jaw working. He needed to get the coat off her. He didn't do it with care. He rolled her roughly onto her side, unbuttoning the heavy wool and dragging it off her shoulders. Underneath, she wore a thin, threadbare grey sweater that clung to her prominent collarbones and a pair of faded jeans. He left those on. He wasn't a nurse. He pulled the duvet out from under her, tossing the heavy covers over her shivering form. He took the IV bag and hung it from a floor lamp he dragged over from the corner of the room. Then he closed the door and left her alone. It was past midnight when the silence of the penthouse was broken by a soft, dull thud. Declan was in his study, nursing a glass of bourbon and staring at a spreadsheet outlining shipping routes out of the docks. He paused, his hand hovering over the mouse. He waited. Silence. He set the glass down, a sigh escaping his lips. He unholstered the small, suppressed pistol he kept in his desk drawer, a reflex, not a conscious choice, and walked silently down the carpeted hallway toward the guest room. He opened the door without making a sound. The room was dark, save for the ambient city light bleeding through the sheer curtains. The bed was empty. The duvet had been thrown aside, pooling on the floor. The IV line lay tangled on the mattress, the needle pulled out, leaving a small, dark stain of blood on the white sheets. Declan's grip tightened on the pistol. His eyes scanned the room. The closet door was closed. The bathroom door was open, but the lights were off. Then he heard it. A faint, rapid, terrified breathing. It was coming from the floor. Declan lowered the weapon. He walked over to the bed and crouched down, lifting the heavy fabric of the bed skirt. Maeve was wedged underneath the bed frame. She had dragged herself into the narrow, dusty gap between the floor and the mattress slats. She was curled into a tight fetal position, her back pressed against the wall, staring out at him with wide, unblinking eyes like a cornered animal. She was clutching her bleeding arm where she had ripped the IV out. "What are you doing?" Declan asked. His voice was a flat, exhausted monotone. Maeve didn't answer. She just pressed herself harder against the wall, trying to disappear into the drywall. Declan let the bed skirt drop. He stood up, running a hand over his face. He felt a migraine building behind his temples, sharp and vicious. He understood what she was doing. He had seen it before, in men who had spent too much time in solitary confinement, or kids pulled out of abusive homes. You put them in an open space, and their brains short-circuited. The expanse of the room, the softness of the bed, it felt exposed. It felt like a trap. The tight, claustrophobic dark under the bed offered a physical boundary. It was defensible. It felt safe. Declan went to the adjoining bathroom. He wet a washcloth with warm water, opened the medicine cabinet, and grabbed a small square of gauze and medical tape. He walked back out and crouched by the bed again, lifting the skirt. "Come out," he said. She shook her head violently, her breath hitching. "I'm not asking, Maeve." Declan's tone darkened, the edge returning to his voice. "You are bleeding on my hardwood floor. You ripped a needle out of your vein. Get out from under the bed." "No," she rasped. "Too bright. Too big." Declan stared at her in the shadows. He could reach under, grab her by the ankle and drag her out. It would be easy. She wouldn't be able to stop him. He didn't. Instead, he tossed the wet washcloth, the gauze, and the tape under the bed. It landed inches from her face. "Clean the blood," he ordered. "Tape the gauze over the puncture wound. If you bleed on the floor, I will pull you out by your hair. Do you understand?" Maeve looked at the medical supplies, then up at his face, visible in the sliver of light beneath the bed. She nodded, a tiny, jerky motion. With trembling fingers, she reached out and took the washcloth. Declan let the bed skirt fall back into place, plunging her back into darkness. He stood up, looking at the massive, empty bed. He stripped the blood-stained sheet off the mattress, balled it up, and threw it into the corner. He walked out of the room, leaving the door cracked open just an inch. He went back to his study, poured himself another finger of bourbon, and sat down at his desk. The spreadsheet blurred before his eyes. He hated disorder. He hated unpredictability. And now he had a half-dead woman living under the furniture in his guest room. He took a slow sip of the whiskey. The burning sensation grounded him. Tomorrow he would force her to eat. The day after that, he would have Weaver check her lungs again. and on the third day he would throw her out. That was the plan. It was a logical, clinical plan. But as he sat in the silence of his fortress, Declan couldn't stop thinking about the absolute, primal terror in her eyes when she looked at the open room, and the strange, quiet relief she found in the dark. Sunlight did not reach the corridor where the guest room sat. It was designed that way. Heavy blackout curtains, thick acoustic doors, a space built for isolation. Declan stood outside the wood-paneled door holding a ceramic mug. The porcelain was scalding against his bare skin, transmitting the heat of the chicken broth he had just microwaved. He hadn't made it from scratch. He wasn't a chef. It was a high-end gelatinous stock from a jar, salted heavily, but it smelled like roasted marrow and thyme. He didn't knock. He turned the handle and pushed the door open with his shoulder. Maeve was no longer under the bed. She had dragged herself out at some point during the night, though she hadn't made it far. She sat slumped against the wall adjacent to the bathroom door, her knees pulled tight to her chest. She was awake. Her eyes tracked him the moment he crossed the threshold, dull and heavy-lidded, but entirely lucid. The fever had broken. What remained was the pale, shivering aftermath of a body that had burned all its fuel. Declan walked over. He didn't hover. He crouched directly in front of her, the knee of his dark trousers brushing the dirty denim of her jeans. He held out the mug. Steam curled into the cold air between them. The smell of the broth hit her, and her stomach gave a violent, audible lurch. She swallowed hard, her throat clicking dryly. "Take it," Declan said. She reached out. Her hands were a disaster, stained with oil, scraped raw at the palms, the knuckles white with tension. As her fingers closed around the ceramic, a violent tremor seized her forearms. She couldn't support the weight. The mug tilted, hot liquid slopping over the edge, splashing onto the floor between them. She gasped, pulling her hands back as if burned, bracing herself for a strike. She squeezed her eyes shut, her shoulders hiking up to her ears. Declan didn't move. He kept his grip firm on the mug, stabilizing it before she could drop it completely. He looked at the spilled broth on the imported rug, then at her terrified, cowering posture. A muscle ticked in his jaw. "Open your eyes," he commanded softly. She didn't. Her breathing hitched, fast and shallow. "Maeve, look at me." She forced her eyelids open. The hazel of her irises was clouded with exhaustion and fear. "I am not going to hit you over spilled soup," Declan said, his voice flat, devoid of both anger and comfort. "I deal in millions of dollars and human lives. A stained rug does not register on my list of concerns. Do you understand?" She stared at him, trying to parse the truth in his cold, dark eyes. He was a terrifying man. The sharp lines of his face, the immaculately groomed stubble, the sheer physical density of his shoulders beneath his tailored shirt. He was built for violence. Yet, here he was, holding a hot mug of cheap broth. Slowly she nodded. "Good." Declan shifted his weight. "Your muscles are shot. You can't hold it." He didn't offer to feed her like a child. He simply adjusted his grip. "Wrap your hands around mine. Let the heat transfer." Maeve hesitated. The idea of touching him willingly felt like putting her hand into a wolf's mouth, but the smell of the salt and the chicken was an agonizing pull. She reached out again, her cold, trembling fingers wrapping tentatively around the backs of his hands. His skin was warm, calloused, rough along the knuckles, but incredibly steady. It was the anchor her failing nervous system needed. Declan guided the rim of the mug to her cracked lips. "Small sips. If you throw it up, I'm not making more." She took a sip. The liquid burned her throat, thick and rich with sodium, coating the raw lining of her stomach. She let out a small, involuntary whimper, a sound of pure, desperate relief. She tried to gulp it, her hands tightening on his, pulling the mug closer. "Slow down," Declan warned, pulling the mug back an inch. "You'll shock your stomach. Breathe." He forced her to pace herself. Sip. Wait. Breathe. Sip. For 10 minutes, the only sounds in the room were her ragged breathing and the soft clink of the ceramic. Declan stayed in his crouched position, ignoring the burning ache in his thighs, watching her face. Up close, without the distortion of the garage shadows, he could see the intricate map of her survival. A faint, faded scar cutting through her left eyebrow. The uneven chop of her hair, likely done with a dull blade to avoid grabbing hands. She wasn't a street kid who made a wrong turn. She was hunted. When the mug was empty, Declan pulled it away. Maeve let her hands drop, slumping back against the wall. The salt and heat had brought a faint, bruised flush back to her cheeks. She looked exhausted, but she no longer looked like a corpse. "Thank you," she rasped. Her voice was barely a whisper. Declan stood up, his joints popping quietly. He looked down at her. "Weaver says you need 3 days. You get 3 days. Today is day 2. You will use the shower in that bathroom. You will scrub the dirt off your skin. I will leave clean clothes on the bed." He turned toward the door. "Why?" The word stopped him. Declan glanced back over his shoulder. Maeve was looking at him, her arms wrapped tightly around her stomach. "Why are you letting me stay?" she asked, her voice cracking. "You don't know me. I'm nothing." Declan looked at her. He didn't have a poetic answer. He didn't believe in poetry. He believed in control, in order, in leveraging power. He thought about the men he dealt with. Men who begged, men who lied, men who sold their own blood to save their skins. And then he looked at the woman who had curled up on freezing concrete without making a sound, expecting nothing but to die quietly in a corner. "Because you didn't scream," Declan said simply. He walked out, pulling the door shut behind him, leaving her alone with the lingering smell of broth and the heavy silence of the penthouse. Day 3 arrived with the relentless grey persistence of a winter storm. Rain lashed against the reinforced glass of the living room windows, distorting the city lights into blurred, streaky lines. Maeve sat on the edge of the dark green velvet sofa. She was clean. It had taken her an hour in the shower, sitting on the marble floor under the scalding spray, scrubbing until her skin was raw and pink. The hot water had awakened every bruised nerve ending in her body. Her left side throbbed with a deep, grinding ache where the ribs were cracked. The bruise on her jaw had blossomed into a spectacular, ugly collage of mustard yellow and sickly green. She was wearing Declan's clothes, a black cotton t-shirt that hung halfway to her knees and a pair of grey sweatpants she had rolled up 4 times at the waist and ankles. She smelled like his soap, sandalwood and sharp cedar. The scent was enveloping, heavy and strangely grounding. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. The deadline was here. Weaver had come by earlier, checked her lungs, grunted his approval at the diminished fluid, and left a bottle of painkillers on the counter. The pneumonia was retreating. She could walk without collapsing. She could hold down solid food. She was no longer a dying stray, she was just a trespasser. The front door unlocked with a heavy metallic clank. Declan stepped into the foyer. He was wearing a dark wool overcoat, his shoulders dusted with fine droplets of rain. He looked exhausted. The lines around his mouth were deeply carved, and his eyes carried the flat, deadened stare of a man who had spent the day destroying people. He shrugged off the coat, throwing it over a chair, and loosened his tie. He walked into the living room and stopped. He hadn't expected her to be out of the guest room. He definitely hadn't expected her to be sitting on his custom Italian velvet sofa, drowning in his clothes, looking at him with wide, resigned eyes. "I'm ready," Maeve said quietly. Declan paused, his hand halfway to the liquor cabinet. "Ready for what?" "To leave. It's day 3. She stood up. The movement was stiff, her hand instinctively coming up to guard her cracked ribs. She didn't have her boots. She had thrown them away because they were ruined. She stood in a pair of thick wool socks she had found in his drawer. Declan stared at her. The silence in the room stretched, thick and suffocating. He looked at the harsh, ugly bruise on her face, the fragile line of her neck, the way his oversized t-shirt swallowed her frame. He felt a sudden, visceral spike of anger. Not at her. At the mechanical, brutal reality of the world waiting for her at the bottom of the elevator. He poured 2 fingers of scotch. He didn't drink it immediately. He leaned against the polished granite counter, swirling the amber liquid. "Sit down," he ordered. Maeve froze. "But I said sit down, Maeve." His voice cracked like a whip. She sank back onto the velvet cushions, her posture rigid. Declan walked over and sat in the leather armchair opposite the sofa. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, the glass dangling loosely from his fingertips. "You told me nobody was looking for you," Declan said. Maeve's breath caught. Her hands tightened in her lap. "Garrett pulled the exterior security feeds from the last 48 hours, Declan continued, his voice terrifyingly calm. "There's a man. Late 20s, scabbed knuckles, meth teeth, wearing a surplus military jacket. He's been circling the block. He asked the bodega owner across the street if he'd seen a blonde girl in an oversized coat. He showed him a picture." Declan took a slow sip of his scotch. His dark eyes locked onto hers, pinning her to the upholstery. "Who is he, Maeve?" The color drained from her face, leaving her chalky white beneath the bruises. Her chest began to heave, the panic rising rapidly, choking off her air. He found me." "Who is he?" Declan repeated, the volume of his voice dropping, which made it infinitely more dangerous. "His name is Hollis," she whispered, her voice shaking violently. I owed him. Not money. I stole something from him." "What did you steal?" Maeve looked down at her lap. A tear slipped free, cutting a hot track over her cheek. "A ledger, a notebook. He uses it to track the girls he moves, the ones he sells. I was supposed to be one of them. I took the book. I thought if I had it, I could trade it to the cops for protection. But the cops in my precinct work for him. He found out. He beat me. I managed to break a window and run." She looked up at Declan, her face a mask of pure despair. "I dropped the book in an alley 2 days ago. I have nothing left. If he knows I'm in this building, he'll wait outside until I starve or walk out. And then he will kill me." Declan stared at her. The room was deathly quiet, save for the patter of rain against the glass. She wasn't a thief. She wasn't a junkie. She was a ghost running from a monster, and she had accidentally crawled into the cave of a bigger, darker monster. "I'll leave right now," Maeve said, standing up again, her voice frantic, bordered on hysterical. "I'll go out the back. I'll draw him away. I won't bring him to your door. I swear. Just let me use the stairs." She took a step toward the foyer. Declan moved. He didn't stand up gracefully. He surged out of the chair, his hand shooting out to grab her wrist. His grip was a steel manacle. The sudden stop jerked her back, and she gasped, her hands instinctively coming up to protect her face. Declan didn't hit her. He pulled her roughly toward him until she was inches from his chest. She was trembling so hard her teeth rattled. "You really think I care about a gutter rat circling my building?" Declan snarled, his breath hot against her face. You think I'm afraid of a low-level trafficker? He'll cause problems for you, she cried out, trying to pull her wrist free. I am the problem, Declan said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, deadly whisper. I own the streets he walks on. I own the cops he pays off. He is nothing but a speck of dirt on my shoe. He let go of her wrist, his hands coming up to grip her shoulders. He felt the sharp jut of her collarbones beneath his shirt. He was acutely aware of how easily he could snap her in half. You are not going down the stairs, Declan stated, his eyes boring into hers. You are not going out the back door. You are going to sit on that sofa. You are going to watch the rain. And you are going to wait for me to come back. Maeve stared up at him, her chest heaving, her mind struggling to process his words. Where are you going? Declan let go of her shoulders. He turned away, picking up his empty glass and setting it on the counter. He walked to the foyer and picked up his heavy wool coat. To take out the trash, he said. He didn't look back as he opened the heavy door and stepped into the hallway. The locking mechanism engaged with a loud, final click, sealing her inside the fortress. The wait was an agony of silence. Maeve sat on the velvet sofa, her knees pulled to her chest, listening to the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. An hour passed. Then 2. The rain intensified, drumming against the glass like restless fingers. She could have run. The door locked from the outside, but she could twist the deadbolt from the inside and disappear. She had spent her entire life running, slipping through cracks, avoiding the heavy hands of angry men. But as she looked around the dark, sprawling penthouse, she realized something terrifying. She didn't want to run. The man who lived here was brutal. He was cold. He commanded violence with the casual ease of a man ordering coffee. But he had steadied her hands when she couldn't hold a mug. He had forced her to breathe. He had shielded her from the cold concrete. He was a monster, yes. But for the first time in her miserable life, he was her monster. At 11:42 p.m., the front door unlocked. Maeve flinched, standing up quickly, her bare toes sinking into the plush rug. Declan stepped inside. He didn't bother turning on the foyer light. The ambient glow from the city illuminated his silhouette. He locked the door behind him and stood in the shadows for a long moment, breathing heavily. He shrugged off the wool coat. It hit the hardwood floor with a wet, heavy thud. He walked into the living room. Maeve's breath caught in her throat. His knuckles were split, raw and bleeding freely. There was a smear of dark crimson across his left cheekbone, and a cut on his lower lip that had swelled. His white dress shirt was missing its tie, the top 3 buttons ripped open, the collar stained with a terrifying amount of arterial spray. He smelled like rain, copper, and adrenaline. He didn't look at her. He walked straight to the liquor cabinet, grabbing a bottle of bourbon with his bloody hand, not bothering with a glass. He pulled the cork out with his teeth, spat it onto the counter, and took a long, deep pull directly from the bottle. Maeve stood frozen. She knew the mechanics of violence. She knew what a man looked like after he had beaten someone to a pulp. The air around him was vibrating with a dangerous, lethal energy. He lowered the bottle. He rested his hands on the granite counter, his head bowed, his broad shoulders rising and falling with each heavy breath. Blood dripped slowly from his knuckles, pooling on the polished stone. "Is he?" Maeve started, her voice a fragile, tiny thing in the massive room. "He's gone," Declan said. His voice was hoarse, rough like sandpaper. "He won't be looking for you. Nobody will be looking for him. It's done." Maeve swallowed hard. The finality in his words was absolute. Hollis was dead. A man who had terrorized her for months had been erased from the earth in 2 hours, simply because this man had decided he was an annoyance. Slowly, Carefully, Maeve took a step forward. She didn't know what possessed her. Every instinct she had developed told her to stay away from a bleeding, angry man. But she walked across the rug, her steps silent, until she was standing just a few feet behind him. "You're bleeding," she said softly. Declan let out a harsh, bitter laugh. He didn't turn around. "It's not all mine." "I know." She stepped closer. She reached out, her small, pale hand, hesitant, and lightly touched the center of his back, right between his shoulder blades. The moment her fingers made contact with the damp cotton of his shirt, Declan went completely rigid. The muscles in his back turned to stone. For a second, she thought he was going to turn around and strike her. Instead, a long, shuddering sigh tore its way out of his chest. He closed his eyes, his head dropping further. Maeve walked around him, stepping into the narrow space between his body and the counter. She looked up at his face. The cut on his lip was still oozing. His eyes were dark, fathomless, staring down at her with a heavy, guarded intensity. She reached up. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she didn't pull back. She pressed her thumb against his cheekbone, right at the edge of the blood smear, and gently wiped it away. Declan's breath hitched. His massive, bloody hands came up, hovering over her waist, not quite touching her, as if he were afraid his stained hands would ruin the only clean thing in his orbit. "You should have left," Declan whispered, his voice incredibly low, a rough rumble vibrating in his chest. "When I walked out that door, you should have run. I gave you an out." "I don't have anywhere to go," she murmured, her thumb tracing the line of his bruised jaw. "I am not a good man, Maeve." He leaned down, his face inches from hers, the smell of bourbon and blood washing over her. "I don't save people. I destroy them. I break things for a living." "I'm already broken," she replied, her hazel eyes locking fiercely onto his. "You can't break me any more than the world already has." Declan stared at her. He saw the defiance in her posture, the raw, brutal honesty in her eyes. She wasn't an innocent princess needing rescue. She was a survivor. She understood the dark, bloody currency of his world, and she was choosing to stay in it anyway. With a low groan, Declan closed the distance. He didn't kiss her gently. There was no romance in it. It was a collision. His hands finally clamped down on her hips, his grip bruising, pulling her flush against his solid, heavy frame. His mouth crashed down on hers, hard, desperate, and tasting of copper and whiskey. Maeve gasped against his lips, her hands flying up to grip the lapels of his ruined shirt. She didn't pull away. She kissed him back with equal desperation, her nails biting into his chest, anchoring herself to the storm. It was a messy, imperfect kiss. It was the clash of two damaged people who had found a twisted, violent sanctuary in each other. When Declan finally broke the kiss, he rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing heavily in the quiet kitchen. His hand slid up her back, resting heavily on her shoulder blades, claiming her weight. "You're not sleeping on the concrete anymore," he murmured roughly against her mouth, his thumb dragging across the faint scar on her eyebrow. "You hear me? You're mine now. You stay here." Maeve closed her eyes, leaning her aching, battered body fully into his heat. She heard the possessive, dangerous vow in his words, and for the first time in her life, the sound of a cage locking shut felt exactly like freedom. "I know," she whispered. Outside, the rain continued to wash the city streets, cold and unforgiving. But inside the fortress, the concrete floor was empty, and the boss had finally put his phone away for good. Did you feel the tension crackling in the air? This wasn't a fairy tale. It was raw, brutal survival crashing into unapologetic power. If Declan and Maeve's dark, slow burn romance kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Want more gritty, deeply emotional mafia stories where the anti-hero falls first and falls hardest? Subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss a chapter. Drop a comment below. Would you have stayed in the penthouse, or would you have run? Share this video with a friend who loves a dark romance, and I'll see you in the next story.